Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always by my co-host Nick Filato. Today we're here to recap all the news in the last 24 hours, with the exception of the Wink Martindale side of it, because we just did a whole podcast wrapping that up. You can find that on our feeds. But now we're going to be discussing everything else that went down for the Giants and continues to go down and evolve as we speak right now, because there is news continuing to break as we go through. We're going to hit it as we go, Nick. But yeah, a lot of stuff going down in Giants land. Just to recap for those who may not know, and I think everybody knows this point, but you never know. The Giants obviously parted ways with Martindale. He resigned. The Giants parted ways with Bobby Johnson, their offensive line coach. Thomas McGahee, their special teams coach, who's been here for a long time. And then obviously, we're going to be seeing new outside linebackers coach and Wilkins, and obviously one more assistant from Wink, who I'm blanking on now, just because
Kevin Wilkins.
Kevin Wilkins, yes, the Wilkins bros. So a lot of news, Nick. Where do you want to start as far as all? And then obviously one thing I also want to talk about, Nick, on today's show is, because we didn't get a chance to do it yesterday, is Joe Schoene's presser. And I know it was brief, but there were a lot of interesting comments in it that I've highlighted here that I want to break down with you as well. So where do you want to start there?
Got to start with Bobby Johnson. This is not a surprise. Him and Thomas McGahee. These are the two coaches that New York Giant fans and people who cover the team expected would be fired. Now, Thomas McGahee, he had, I think it was 2019. He was a solid special teams coordinator with Pat Shurmur. He survived the Joe Judge era, and he came in here, and it's been a pretty bad 2 years. So it was about time for the Giants to part ways with Thomas McGahee. No one was really going to disagree with that. And then Bobby Johnson, he came in last year. The Giants have not really got any development from any of their offensive linemen. They've had 3 or 4 young offensive linemen that were selected. They were brought in, and we have not seen any positive development. And I don't really know what's worse from the 2023 season, the pass blocking or the run blocking, because the run blocking wasn't all that great this year. That also was compounded by a slightly deteriorating Saquon Barkley, who's getting a little bit long in the tooth. So that didn't help either. John Michael Schmitz, even. Love John Michael Schmitz, Dan. John Michael Schmitz, I think I did rookie, and this might be something we could do on a later podcast. I did rookie grades or whatever at Big Blue View. You go check it out. It might have dropped already. And I gave him a C. And it was relative. It was relative to the draft slot. So, like Jordan Riley, I think I gave like a B minus.
Oh,
it's not, yeah. So it was relative to the draft slot, right? Mm-hmm. But a C. You spent the 57th pick on John Michael Schmitz. I don't think he was bad. I think we saw highlights and flashes that are going to make you be like, nice. But there were still a lot of miscommunications. And can you blame the guards next to him? Possibly. I don't know exactly who is at fault. It didn't match, I think, my initial feeling of what he would be like when he came into the league. So the parting the ways of Bobby Johnson, that had to happen. If that didn't happen, Giants Twitter would have freaking burned something down.
Yeah, I know. Look, like, as we always say on this podcast, Nick, neither you nor I are in the room, so we don't really know who's fully responsible for when an offensive line is as bad as the Giants' offensive line has been under Bobby Johnson. Is it all the coach? I don't know. But there are a lot of examples of guys like Mike Munchak and Callahan coming in and just turning around offensive lines. Even the job, and I know people have put his name out there, the offensive line coach in Atlanta. I mean, like, that offensive line turned around really fast as well. So I do think there is just, I'll never be able to prove this, Nick, and I know you won't either, and we're not trying to, but there is definitely a correlation between offensive line coaches and offensive lines. I feel like it's a unit that relies more on the coaches than other units, because it's a unit that relies on continuity and playing together. I feel like secondary is also a big one of these, corners and DBs, like a big one where the communication is a huge factor. So the coaching is more of a factor. I can't confirm that. It's just my speculation. It's just, based on what I've known in football and what I've learned in football. So I do think it's important that the Giants make this decision, because it's not just that Giants Twitter would have melted down if they retain Bobby Johnson and they would have been, oh, Brian Dable's just a crony. It's that I don't want him here anymore. I want something new on the offensive line. I want an opportunity to maybe lean on one of these really proven coaches. And that was something that really caught my attention in Joe Schoene's presser, because and I'm going to get the quote right now just so I don't botch it, Nick, but when they asked Joe Schoene about the offensive line, he said, I think when Dabes is looking for a new offensive line coach, the history of developing players will be something that we're going to definitely lean on. And that's something that maybe Bobby Johnson didn't come in with, right? Like, that's not, who has he developed? Bobby Johnson before his time with the Giants? Can you think of any offensive lineman that really flourished under him or became somebody who they wasn't?
The Colts offensive line wasn't really a bad unit when he was there. Then he went to the Bills, and the Bills, I think the offensive line maybe looked a little bit better because they had freaking Josh Allen and they had Brian Dable and Stephon Diggs, and they were clicking on all cylinders. But I'm just looking right here with the New York Giants. You gave him Evan Neal. This guy was a top 10 pick. And yeah, he had some balance issues in college, but that's been maximized. He's had been slow out of his stance. His hand usage seems to have not been as crisp as it was when he was in college. He has not adapted to the speed, and that was a whole disaster. And then Josh Azudu, and then Marcus McKethan. Now, Marcus McKethan missed his rookie season. I get that, but you haven't seen any of these players and John Michael Schmitz take that developmental step that you expect. And I'm not asking them to become all pros in year one, but at least be at least live up to your potential and what we thought you were going to be, even in just your rookie season or your second year. Sure. And also just the unit in general was a mess too. They never really played as a unit. And maybe you could say, and I think it's fair to at least put this argument out there, some of this also falls on Joe Schoene for some of his decisions, or whoever is making some of the decisions and not retaining guys like Tyree Phillips and forcing Josh Azudu to play left tackle way out of position. Right. I think that is a issue that maybe stemmed above Bobby Johnson, but Bobby Johnson was given a certain criteria to work with, certain circumstances to work with, and he didn't necessarily not even come close to maximizing it. I don't even think he really did that good of a job at all in making anything that was adequate. Really, it was a bad offensive line 2 years in a row, so he had to go.
Yeah, and at times it was historically bad, and it was just moments of just absolute despair on the offensive line. And I can talk about like the injuries. He can't control that. Bobby Johnson, nobody can. Andrew Thomas getting hurt, Josh Azudu playing there. That's maybe more on the GM, like you said. But the development is the key thing, man, Nick. Like that's what comes down to it. Like I look at like how, for example, Dexter Lawrence's hand usage is now versus before Andre Patterson got here. And then, like you said, how the hand usage is for John Michael Schmitz and Evan Neal and these other guys, and how the footwork is for those guys pre and post Bobby Johnson. And there's just not any tangible progress. And in some ways you can even be like, did these guys go backwards somehow? Like Evan Neal to me feels like a guy who somehow just went backwards. And maybe you could just say the truth of the matter is that he's not able to make that jump from a speed standpoint from college athletes to the NFL. Maybe the case. He may bust, and that may be the case. But I can't sit here and say for certainty Evan Neal is definite bust. I can say there's a possibility that Bobby Johnson has played a role in Evan Neal's lack of development and trajectory that he's currently on. And if that's the case, and that's even a possibility, you can't continue to employ that guy. And I'm happy the Giants recognize that, and they're going to go a different route here. This is a big one for me though, Nick. Like I'm tired of the nice, of the upcomers. Like who's the guy they got from Louisiana, Lafayette, that I'm forgetting right now, the last one, Robert Hunt and Sale. Yeah, not Robert Hunt.
Hunt was the guy,
the old lineman from there. Yeah, the guy he could. Robert Sale, a young guy, didn't work out. Bobby Johnson. Like, we need to go for one of these developed offensive line coaches, the ones that cost a lot of money to pay, none of which goes against the cap, by the way, just all out of John Mara's pocket. And who gives a shit crap about that? He already paid Wink Martindale crazy amounts, and he's resigning. Like, he doesn't care. He never has cared about paying coordinators. He's willing to do it, Mara. Everyone says, oh, he's the worst owner in sports. It's like, I can think of a lot of worse owners, the cheap ones. I would much rather have Mara than a lot of these cheap owners who don't spend to the cap every year. He spends to the cap every year, and he spends on coordinators, Mara. So he will do that, I hope. But it's time for me, at least, Nick, to get one of these established guys, someone who's going to really set the tone. And the problem, the concern for me there, Nick, and we haven't discussed this yet. I haven't seen this discussed at all on Giants Twitter. I'm bringing this up now, is thinking about what went down with Brian Dable and with Wink Martindale, right? Thinking about what went down with Brian Dable and Kafka, which is a lot of, I feel like, Kafka deferring to Dable and understanding his role. Are we going to be able to get a guy in here like Callahan who's going to want to take control? When Callahan takes over an offensive line, Nick, you know this, he takes over a run game as well. It's not just, he's not taking over just the offensive line. He's establishing his run game there. Is Brian Dable going to be willing to give over that amount of control and power and authority. A guy with an ego like Dable who wants all that and wanted to have it on defense as well. He's going to be able to willing to give that over to a new offensive line coach to say, look, you can establish your O-line the way you want and you can establish the run game, because we know that you're telling us that it all fits together. You need to be able to have authority over your run game and what we're calling in the run game in addition to the offensive line. That's a question I have, because I know for a guy like Bill Callahan, for example, Nick, he's going to want to have that authority.
Yeah, Bill Callahan is currently the offensive line coach of the Broncos. So that's not going to be an option. I know you know that, but
I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah,
like,
Mike
Munchak,
Munchak
Callahan type. Yeah,
Mike Munchak is the individual that Giant fans should be looking at. I have no idea if he wants to come out of retirement. He hasn't coached since 2021. I don't think he is that old. I think he is. Yeah,
Daughters live on the West Coast. It's a big problem. He's a West Coast.
That's the thing. Yeah, he's a West
Coast. I gotta
Coast
be honest
guy.
with you, Nick, and you lived there for a little while. If I ever lived on the freaking West Coast and I wasn't born here, there's not a 0% chance I would move away from those mountains to come to this trash outside that we're dealing with. This,
jeez, yeah, it is really good.
Crap. It's snowing. It sucks.
I know it sucks.
This ain't the mountains.
No, it's not the mountains. So getting a guy like Mike Munchak, it seems unlikely. So who are the other offensive line coaches? That's going to be a job that Joe Schoene, Brian Dable, and the Giants brass, they're going to have to define. Now, I'm with you, man. And I think we as Giant fans may have some PTSD from the Joe Judge time with the offensive line when they brought in Mark Colombo. Joe Judge and Mark Colombo almost got into a fight, and then they brought in Dave DeGuglielmo, and that almost screwed up Andrew Thomas's development. The Giants need to nail this, because you can't have a top 7 pick in Evan Neal flounder. That's so detrimental to what you're trying to do as a football team, not hitting on a top 10 pick, especially on the offensive line. Like, we bitch and we complain about the offensive line. The Giants have poured assets into the offensive line. There are a lot of teams in the NFL who have fully functioning offensive lines, top 10 offensive lines.
How the Rams do that?
The Rams are the team I was just about to go to. The Giants, you have 2 top 10 picks to anchor your tackles. You have a second round pick at center.
We should be in great shape right now on the offensive line, dude. From a draft capital investment standpoint, we should be looking at like one of the new top 10 O-lines in the NFL.
And there's still a narrative out there that the Giants don't pay attention to the. It's like, dude, what are you paying attention to? The Giants pay attention to the offensive line. They just can't develop it. There's no continuity out there. That's the problem. So you need to nail this coach. I don't know who the hell the coach is going to be, but you need to nail this, because if you don't, and this ends up being another shitty situation, another bad offensive line, and another just coach that
Gable's
maybe
gone.
Gable's gone. Shane's gone. This is a really important hire for this staff.
Yes, you're right. This is a monumental hire. Obviously, the DC will be a big hire too.
Yeah.
There's a little early news on that front. According to Ian Rappaport, the Giants are interviewing Raiders offensive line coach Carmen Bricillo. This guy's got to be Italian, dude. Carmen is an old school Italian name, and I love that name.
Wait,
Carmen.
Can you say that? Carmen.
Carmen. No, Carmen.
Is that Carmine? Carmine would be the real Italian
Carmine.
name. No, it's not. It's not. But Carmine to me would be that real Italian. Carmen's still Italian. But I'll say this: him and Tommy DeVito, they're going to be doing this. If you're watching on YouTube so much together.
Bricillo, that's got to be Italian. But he joined Josh McDaniels in Vegas. He was with the Patriots for 3 years, which I like because he probably spent some time under. I'm trying to remember the time.
Dante Scarnecchia, yeah.
I got to assume Scarnecchia hadn't retired by that much. So he probably learned under Scarnecchia, which is always good.
Carmen Bricillo, almost like Carmine again. It's like a natural thing for this Paisan to just do that. But it's not like he had a ton of talent on the Raiders offensive line.
Yeah.
And this is a tweet from Walter WBG84. So I want to shout him out. He says they've had the 12th fewest sacks in 2 seasons. They've only allowed 75 sacks. And we know that they had a pretty potent rushing attack with Josh Jacobs. And I think a lot of that is on Josh Jacobs as well. He led the league in rushing in 2022. So there's at least something to Bricillo that you can point to and be like, they had a solid unit. You had the situation with Alex Leatherwood. I don't know how much of that was on Bricillo because he predated Leatherwood, but then I think Bricillo came in and then they got rid of Leatherwood like maybe months into his job, if I'm not mistaken, because Bricillo took over the Raiders offensive line in the beginning of 2022. Before that, he was with the Patriots dating back to 2019. 2019, he was a coaching assistant working under Dante Scarnecchia, which was Dante Scarnecchia. He's the GOAT of all offensive linemen. That was Dante Scarnecchia's last year. Then he became the co-offensive line coach in 2020, and then he was the offensive line coach in 2021 for the New England Patriots. Now, if I'm not mistaken, those Patriot offensive lines, they were a little turbulent. They weren't that great, right? But we've seen the last 2 years him be able to stabilize a situation that didn't necessarily have, I would say, the talent, or at least the perceived talent of who the Giants have right now on the offensive line.
That's a great point, Nick. And I feel like even just watching the Raiders that we've seen this year versus the Giants, that game, thinking about the film back to that game, they got good things going in the run game this year. They really did when they leaned on Jacobs after the Pierce.
And Zamir White, man.
In. And Zamir White, you're right, at the end. So, like, there may be an opportunity for him to develop that run game out in a way the Giants really weren't able to consistently, at least. And his coaching career dates way back to 2003. He started as a high school assistant coach, and he was an offensive line coach at Akron for a while. Illinois, he was an offensive assistant. Youngstown State, offensive line coach. And then you went over his career in the NFL, which flourished after that, starting in 2019. So I'm intrigued by him. I obviously don't, this is not essentially, going the Munchak route per se, but it's definitely intriguing.
It is intriguing. I love how you skipped over one college where he started as the offensive line coach in 2005. You deliberately skipped over it.
I deliberately skipped over that because I didn't know how to pronounce Duquesne or Duquesne or whatever.
I think it's just Duquesne, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, no. So that's where I'm at with it. I'm interested. He's 47 years old, so he's still a younger coach out there, and he has somewhat of a track record. And he also has the ties to New England, which we know Brian Daboll has the ties to New England. Now, they weren't there at the same time, but he spent several years in New England, and I know that Brian Daboll does know Bill Belichick very well. So I'm sure that he'll be informed on that. We've seen that in the past. They'll blow up in our face as Giant fans with Joe.
We have seen that in the past. I'm curious when if his arrival in Las Vegas with the Raiders aligned at all with Colton Miller's big jump. Because remember,
Miller jumped before that.
Before that.
Yeah, Miller jumped before that. But he was with McDaniel, who is not a likable person, to be frank. I'm somebody in the media. I don't know him personally, but looking at him and how he ran that team, it was not great. So I'm hoping that this guy doesn't necessarily share that same type of approach. I'm not saying that he does, but he needs a new, fresh start. The Giants are interested in him, and hopefully he can develop, if he does come here, if he does accept this job, hopefully he can develop some of these draft picks that we have that have underwhelmed, is a nice way to say it.
You never know when you're going to potentially find like a diamond in the rough at any of these positions. That's the thing. Like, we want the Mike Munchak because we assume and we feel secure about getting a guy with a track record like that. But you can also hit if you go the other route. I saw an interesting tweet on some of the stats from Carmen Bricillo. And this is from somebody who covers the Raiders, who feels like Carmen Bricillo has done a phenomenal job. He says he's got a line performing at a near elite level with multiple injuries, a platoon starter. This is about the 2023 season, a platoon starter at right guard. And honestly, as I look across that Raiders offensive line, Nick, and you brought this up a little bit earlier, like, besides Colton Miller, I don't see much talent, much really at all. And the injuries were bad. And he's got him in 13th. This is according to Tristan Kuhn, who covers the Raiders. The Raiders were 13th in adjusted line yards, 12th in pass block win rate, 14th in run block win rate, 10th in overall win rate, 6th in pressure rate allowed, 6th best, 9th best in sacks allowed, 4th best in pass block efficiency, 9th best in run block efficiently, 2nd best in just total pressures allowed, 2nd fewest, 3rd fewest total quarterback hits allowed, Nick, 6th best clean pocket rate, 3rd best in average clean pocket time to pressure, 14th in contact behind line of scrimmage, then 9th best in second level blocking efficiency. So just some advanced stats there, really top 15 across the board, not a single one under top 15, a bunch of top 10s in there, a bunch of top 5s in there, going across the board. Now, these are all like advanced stats, and sometimes a lot of people feel like, myself included, advanced stats on the offensive line can be fugazi a little bit to an extent. Sometimes the film doesn't align with what you see in the the grades, but it's got to be worth something. And I feel like, again, eye test wise, when I've seen the Raiders, they've done a really good job there, at least against the Giants this year. So I'm intrigued by him, to say the least.
So we went over Thomas McGahee. Now, I don't know who the Giants are going to replace Thomas McGahee with. It was time for that. We went over Bobby Johnson. We talked a lot about Drew Wilkins and Kevin Wilkins on the last podcast. Before we get into some of the other interesting quotes from this Joe Schoene presser, I think we have to acknowledge that Brandon Brown now has 2 interviews to be the general manager. Brandon Brown's impact, we know stem from him advocating for Daniel Bellinger. I know that was one that was widely publicized. He said, we got to draft Daniel Bellinger. I think that has been a win. That's an early day 3 pick where Daniel Bellinger, look, they have Darren Waller now on the roster. Daniel Bellinger's impact doesn't necessarily play itself out through statistics. It's definitely there on the film though, if you watch. So I think this has been a very valuable addition for Joe Schoene. With the new rules in the NFL, if he does accept the job as general manager, the Giants get a 3rd round pick. And that's something that I look at. 3rd round pick could be very valuable. Can't imagine he accepts a job with Carolina. Like, who the hell wants to be the Carolina Panthers general manager, Dan? That's not something. But the Chargers, he's interviewing there. If they want him, good for him. That would be excellent. And then the Giants would benefit by getting a 3rd round pick, which would be cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be maybe a small net negative still for me. I would consider it to get that 3rd round pick, which is surprising because I love picks. I just feel like Brandon Brown's a really good find for us.
But it's going to happen eventually.
It was going to happen.
He's destined to be a general manager. He's by all reports, I don't know, I'm not in the building. By all reports, he's a very sharp individual, and he has his hand in a lot of the scouting and a lot of what's going on.
Played a big role in Daniel Bellinger, played a big role in some of the big hits the Giants have had. But that's the life cycle of the NFL. I think we knew that even going in, Nick. Like this was, like you said, this was a temporary thing. It's hard to keep somebody like that on. So like at least the compensation would be getting that 3rd round pick. That it'd
be excellent for him too, because he's going into a situation where you have the quarterback settled and you have a lot of work to do, but you're sitting out there on the West Coast, baby, in the mountains you were just talking about. What's going on, Big Blue Banter listeners? I'm excited for the football season for several reasons. And one of those reasons is Prize Picks, which is North America's largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform. And it's so simple to use. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including professionals, sharks, and people who are going to exploit you, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you just watch the winnings roll in. It's very simple to play and gives you a little extra skin. I've set my picks in less than 60 seconds. There are so many stats to choose from, and the withdrawals of funds are easy and quick. Dan and I will be adding a segment to our show before every game where we pick our favorite stats, more or less yards or touchdowns, what have you, and we'll be discussing why from a scheme, matchup, and game theory perspective. I love their promotions and how easy their interface is to operate at Prize Picks. I may select more on tackles for a loss from Bobby Okereke or Kayvon Thibodeau next game. They also do other sports as well. It's a really cool experience. Please join Dan and I in the fun of Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/banter and use code BANTER for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, go to prizepicks.com/banter and use code BANTER for a first deposit match up to $100. You will not regret it. Make Little Caesars, the official pizza sponsor of the NFL, part of your game day. There are few things better in the world than kicking back, watching some football, and biting into some delicious Little Caesars pizza. Order online during our Pizza pregame, 1 hour before and 3 hours after NFL kickoffs, plus all day on Sunday. And get ready for some football and fun. Choose your favorite Little Caesars pizza or pick the toppings you crave. Old World pepperoni, extra cheese, Italian sausage, olives, onions, pineapple if you're into that. Put it on half the pie, the entire pie. There are so many other options that I don't have time to name. Slap that on a round crust, a thin crust, a stuffed crust, a Detroit-style deep dish. Either way, you win. And speaking of winning, everyone scores with convenient delivery or our in-store pizza portal pickup. So grab some friends and enjoy a few slices during the game.
Yeah, I know. It'd be nice. So we'll see what happens if that happens, but we'll tackle that when it does. I want to get into a few things that Joe Schoene said. One we discussed already on the offensive line, but a few other things and just quotes that I took away from his presser that I was intrigued by. So one thing was they asked Joe Schoene, how much does Daniel Jones' injury history overall? And, it's a big history at this point. 2 neck injuries, 1 neck surgery, a torn ACL, multiple injuries in addition to that. If that was it, that would be it. But there's been multiple more injuries. Every year has been missed games with injury except for one. And he said, how much does it take into consideration? Joe Schoen said, absolutely, it does. So I thought that was interesting. Just the fact that he went out and said that they are considering the injury history. He also said it's not out of the question for Tyrod Taylor to come back. He said, we'll talk all UFAs. We'll have conversations with them but he said, I thought he played well for us. And he reiterated this comment that he made, Nick, at the bye week, which was, about the quarterback, about the position. We got to go free agency of the draft. He said that same thing again, how like they're not going to be able to just ignore quarterback. And I guess that's obvious, maybe, but it says to me that the Giants will be adding a quarterback for sure this offseason. It might be a re-signing of Taylor, it might be a draft pick, but they're not just going to sit on their hands and be like, oh, Daniel Jones is back. We assume we'll be ready, and we got DeVito, and we're good to go.
I think Joe Schoen was thankful, not that Daniel Jones got hurt, of course, but that he can at least, with his comments, say, well, we're not sure when he's going to be ready, which is true. But at the same time, even if Daniel
allows
Jones
you to hide
was,
your hand.
it allows you to hide your hand a little bit and kind of hide behind that fact. Oh, yeah, well, we're just not sure if he's ready, Dan. So we have to add somebody. But that's the reason we're adding somebody, not for any other reason. There's some truth to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It does give him a little bit more of a way to kind of disguise his cards and keep them closer to his vest. And I thought that was interesting. He even said on Jones, he's like, there's a chance he's not ready for week 1. So you got to sign somebody that you can hope. Again, you plan, but he did say this, you plan for the worst, but you hope for the best. So you plan for him not being ready. So you're going to need somebody that can hopefully win you some games early on if he's not ready. Thought that was interesting too.
I'm telling you, these guys are smart football minds.
Yeah.
And I think he said, like, yeah, no, we're confident in Daniel Jones because they're not going to say anything other than that. But when they watch Tyrod Taylor throw a 69-yard touchdown, when they watch Tyrod Taylor throw an 80-yard touchdown, when they watch Tyrod Taylor throw a 46-yard strike to a running back up the sidelines, and I'm sorry, you don't see that from Daniel Jones. People are like, oh, he threw a touchdown pass down the sideline to Darius Slayton against Jacksonville. It's like, yeah, he did that one time. But like,
and it was a 30-yarder or 37-yarder.
What Tyrod Taylor
did
the
easiest look ever. He held the safety for a second with his eyes and just threw a one-on-one. Like, come on, guys, that happened once.
He does that, and he can do that in those situations, the one-on-one up. But what we saw from Tyrod Taylor was different, and it's not like Tyrod Taylor is the long-term answer. He's a veteran quarterback. His ability to stretch that's what Brian Daboll wants, and I think Joe Schoen knows that. But you can't say that now that you invested all this money in this quarterback. I think the Giants their back was against the wall. They saw the strides and he made a lot of strides in 2022, the strides Daniel Jones made from Jason Garrett's offense to Brian Daboll's offense. But even in the early parts of this season, we still didn't see any development past that. And throughout all last year, he made a lot of strides. One stride he did not make was creating explosive plays. And that's why the Giants, despite winning a playoff game, were dead last in explosive play rate. You need explosive plays to thrive in the NFL. You need explosive plays to compete in the NFL. Brian Daboll knows that. Joe Schoen knows that. Right now, they're going to ride out Daniel Jones' contract, but they're going to investigate other options at quarterback. And if they bring someone in, you could say, hey, Daniel, we're not sure if you're going to be ready, buddy. Okay, that's why he's here. But if that guy is throwing 69, 80-yard bombs, there has to be a realistic conversation that he should start. There has to be.
And I think there will be. I think there straight up will be. No matter who that person is, I think he's going to have an opportunity finally to compete with Jones. Because I don't really think Tyrod Taylor got a fair opportunity to compete with Jones in 2022. And it's fine because they ended up making the playoffs and Jones had a good year. So it worked out for the Giants. But at this point, after what Jones, and you could say, don't worry about what Jones put on tape in 2023 because the O-line was so injured. But what you'd be ignoring is the fact that there is a possibility that the only reason 2022 was good for Jones was because they figured out a system for him. And once DC's figured out that system, defensive coordinators with the tape, there was no option for Jones. And that may lead to, if you're willing to consider that, which is beyond worth considering, because the system was basically just boot action and quick game and just shit that you don't see really teams running week after week. It reminds me a lot of what the Bears do with Justin Fields, honestly. But if you're willing to consider that, you're willing to consider that there may not be a thing where if the O-line is good in 2020, the O-line was so bad in 2023, you can't judge Jones. Well, the O-line may not be so good in 2024. It may be better, and Jones may still not be able to snap out of it. And that's worth considering at this point. You can't just assume that 2022 is what you're going to get moving forward. That's the thing. I think so many people are willing to consider that 2023 is a wash because he lost Andrew Thomas and all the injuries on the offensive line. We're just going to get 2022 again. But then what about 2021, 2020? What about those? And what about the idea that maybe 2022 was figured out by defensive coordinators, given that they have tape on it. Those are all things that we got to consider at that position. But as far as it goes, that's why I don't really like Joe Schoen said, I have just as much faith of Daniel Jones as I do now than when he signed the contract. I don't know if Joe Schoen's really going to say anything differently if he felt differently, right, Nick?
He
So like,
shouldn't. I
he
would look
shouldn't.
at
So
him.
those
I would look
comments,
at him differently if he was fully truthful with the media and said,
sure,
"Yeah, you know what? He's not really doing what we want him to do. Our starting quarterback, who's getting paid $160
right,
million, who has a torn
and maybe
ACL."
our best option, by the way,
Yeah,
if things
probably
don't
right.
fall the way that they may want them to fall in the draft. That may be it. So they can't bury a guy who may be their best option right now. Like they may not have a guy available to them at 6 overall that they feel is worth investing in. And everyone's like, oh, this is a good quarterback class. Not everyone. Some people are like, Nick, this is a good quarterback class. You got to just make it work. You got to find someone you like at
No.
6. No, me and you will not agree with that. The Big Blue Banter podcast does not agree with that. And I respect the people who feel that way. Some of the smartest people. I know Sal is on that camp. He thinks this camp, shout out Sal from and shout out Monty. They got a great Giants podcast brewing. He's a Giant podcast, but shout out to them. And I know they feel this class is talented enough. The Giants have to make it work at 6 and find a quarterback that they like. I don't subscribe to that. I know you don't either, Nick. I am only willing to take a quarterback at 6 if the Giants feel like he has the elite traits that can make him a top 5. I do not want to go down the Daniel Jones route again at 6. Daniel Jones type again at 6. I can't do it again. I can't live through it. I can't deal with it. I don't want to watch it for 5 years again. I need to get, if I'm taking a swing at 6 overall, I need a top tier talent quarterback with the traits that they believe can be top 5 in the NFL. And if not, I'll take one in round 2 and I'll be just as happy, Nick, because if you're taking a gamble anyway at quarterback, why not take it in round 2 with one of those 2 picks, like the Seattle pick they got or their own pick, then take it at 6 overall just because, oh, it's a talented class. I don't know, man. Like watching Penix and McCarthy last night, are you sure those dudes are NFL quarterbacks? I'm not, and I never have been. I feel very confident about Drake May and Caleb Williams having elite level traits that could, and Jaden Daniels, I'm willing to throw in that as well, given his running ability. I feel very confident in those 3. Any of those 3, I'm fine if they take them at 6. I don't think any of those 3 will be available at 6. I don't think any of those 3 will be even close to available at 6. Maybe Jaden Daniels if they're lucky. I don't think Caleb May or Drake Williams has any shot of moving past 1 or 2, to be completely honest. And I don't think the Giants have the ammo to trade up. But if you don't have elite traits, don't force quarterback. That's what it comes down to, Nick. And let's be honest, Daniel Jones has adequate arm talent. It was never elite. It's just not elite. Anyone can, I hope you have the eyes enough to see that that's not an elite arm. Please, God, I hope you can see it's an adequate arm. It's not an elite arm, but I want some kind of elite traits there. So we'll see what happens there, Nick. But there is a scenario where Daniel Jones is their best option and their only option really to start at quarterback. So you can't bury him right now.
I agree. I think if you do not love these quarterbacks and you kind of have that in your mind, I'm sure they've studied these guys. They already have scouting reports on them. Like all that stuff is already submitted. It's not like they're going to be doing what Dan and I are going to be doing and grinding through the tape and getting our first all 22 impressions on these guys through the next couple months. I think you have to try to bring a guy like Tyrod back. You have to try to bring some sort of veteran back because it's not Tommy DeVito, I don't think, right? It's not Jacob Eason. So Tommy DeVito, I'm fine with Tommy DeVito as a developmental quarterback. But if you actually want to, like, you don't have a lot of years. You don't.
Right.
Like, if you suck next year, you might be out on your ass. Like if this is another embarrassing season like it was this year, is Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen coming back? If Evan Neal still sucks, if Kayvon Thibodeau plateaus and it just kind of stagnates and stays where he's at, do we honestly think Daboll and Schoen are going to be back?
No, probably.
It's the conversation has to be had, and you need to have a legitimate contingency plan if Daniel Jones, A, is not healthy, or B, does not develop at all, which he's not out there running around and training. He's rehabbing right now, right? He's rehabbing. So we have to look at this with a clear, lucid mind and say, we need another option at quarterback. Who can we bring in? And you could say, oh, there really isn't anybody that we can. Yes, there is, because the Giants did it with Tyrod Taylor. And I was one who didn't think Tyrod Taylor could realistically compete with Daniel Jones. And I also was like, hey, Daniel Jones is the young guy. He's the future. We have to at least see what we have. And I get where my train of thought was. But after watching the end of the season, and yes, Tyrod Taylor has faults. He's not John Elway. I'm not making him out to be. But watching him make those throws, it completely flipped my train of thought. I'll admit when I'm wrong. And I'm like, hey, that can unlock an offense. And we did not see that from Daniel Jones. So you have to bring in a guy like that. You have to bring in a veteran quarterback who can push a healthy Daniel Jones if Daniel Jones continues to be hesitant and reluctant to throw the football deep.
And I think it's undeniable, right, Nick? Like I talked about this on Twitter, but you know, Daniel Jones had two consecutive games of 250 yards passing back in 2021, and he did it back in 2019, and then he didn't do those are his only consecutive passing games of 250 plus in his career. It's insane. The Giants don't pass the ball for yards with Daniel Jones at quarterback, or they haven't yet. You could blame it on anything you want, the coaching, the offensive lines over the years, whatever you want to blame it on, but you at this point you can't be in that building and you can't look at it like, holy shit, when Tyrod came in, we actually had some verticality to our passing game. We actually passed 4 yards. Like, if you don't have that bogus call against Jalen Hyatt in that first Buffalo game, that's another 260-yard passing game out of Tyrod Taylor. He had 297 last week. He had 300 the week before. Against Washington, he had 279. He had like 250 in the first half, and they stopped throwing the ball. By the way, both of the last those two of those games, the Washington game for Tyrod and the Philly game for Tyrod, where he threw for 297 and 279. Most of those yards were in the first half. The Giants just milked the clock and ground it out in the second half. They didn't even really let him throw. But in the
I don't
first
even know
half,
what is this. What is this strategy, Dan? What is this strategy? You like teams? They can milk the clock and they say that's something that happens. Holy shit!
Actually, we got it one game,
this.
week 18, and for some reason,
Oh my
it's
God.
amazing that it happened against the Eagles. But like, it's undeniable for anyone in the building, for anyone watching at this point, that there was some passing yardage and some verticality to the passing game with Taylor in there at quarterback. And I know you just said it, Nick, and I agree with you. I think Tyrod Taylor was better this year than Daniel Jones, and I think it's undeniable on tape. And I think it's not because he had, and Andrew Thomas. I'm going to be honest, that's part of it, but not the full reason, and not even close to the full reason. And anyone who says that's 100% of the reason, or then starts to bring in guys like Justin Pugh, is doing so to cope for have their feelings, in my opinion. That's all I'm going to say about that. And I hate to say it, and it's fine. You can think however you want, but like, it's obvious and undeniable. But more importantly, in the building, is it obvious and undeniable? Nick, who cares what we think, right? Who cares what the fans think? And in all reality, in actuality, it's about, do they see it? Do they see what happened with Taylor in that offense? And do they understand that they have to bring in some level of arm talent to this offense and processing power from a mental standpoint to the quarterback position to compete at least with Daniel Jones? I'm not saying to beat out Jones. Jones should still have the opportunity, but just to give him a real chance to compete this time.
Yeah. We've discussed Brian Dable and Joe Schoen all throughout last year, how this was a meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
How Kenny Galladay, I know you're getting paid all this money. Too bad you're not playing. We're going to play David Sills because he's doing all the right things. There are a couple different examples of this. But now, and I think we've seen a little bit of this, now can Joe Schoen and Brian Dable admit when they're wrong, when they make a mistake, and then go over them. Now, we've seen that a little bit with Paris Campbell. They signed Paris Campbell, and they talked about this a little bit in the press conference. He was an insurance plan, but they had plans for Paris Campbell, and he didn't play as much as maybe he would have hoped. And we were excited about Paris Campbell, but Wan'Dale Robinson ended up making a much quicker recovery, and he is the future at the wide receiver position, and Paris Campbell only had a 1-year deal. So they kind of admitted, like, yeah, it didn't necessarily work out, but here was our train of thought. When are you going to have that type of revelation if Daniel Jones doesn't continue to develop as you expected? Would you actually bring someone in to realistically compete for the number one spot? And also, Evan Neal, that's your mistake.
I know.
I'm not there yet because you're bringing in a new offensive line coach. We all wanted that. Can that offensive line coach make him work at right tackle? Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. But now we are long enough in the Joe Schoen and the Brian Dable tenure that we can start asking those questions and say, yeah, you were a meritocracy when it was other people's players.
Sure.
But are you going to be now?
That's a great point, Nick, because it's supposed meritocracy. Well, if it's supposed meritocracy, Daniel Jones deserves to have competition, and so does Evan Neal for that standpoint. Now, I think it's a little different because I think it's so much harder to find competition at right tackle. There's no tackles in the NFL. It's such a shortage around the NFL. It's just hard to find this position. But we saw with our first eyes what competition at quarterback looked like this year for Daniel Jones, Tyrod Taylor, and even Tommy DeVito. Tyrod Taylor especially, though. And I know he has his flaws. We're not calling him Joe Montana. I know he misses the throws that kill you guys, but he also moves the offense considerably better than Jones did this year. And in my opinion, better than they did in 2022. They were dead last in explosive plays in 2022. They won games in 2022. He had some great drives at the end, Jones. Don't want to discredit him for that. The Packers game, an amazing drive and some great moments for sure. The Vikings game against that Donatel defense. But a lot of those games were won 17-13 by, things that were not because we were moving the ball up and down the field. Like at times we did with Tyrod Taylor. I know that it didn't always lead to points. We turned it over in the red zone. Tyrod had his screw ups in the red zone, whatever. No one's saying Tyrod Taylor should be the franchise quarterback of the New York Football Giants. What we're saying is we finally got to see some competition at quarterback and what another quarterback could look like in the system, what two quarterbacks would look like in the system. And we saw some things that were quite frankly better, or at least on par, at the very least, with what Daniel Jones offered at $47 million against the cap. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see what happens at right tackle, because I know you're right. Like, we can't, like, I didn't think Tyree Phillips was that good for the Giants. He was okay player, and now he's the surgery. Whatever. He was fine, Nick. I felt like he got pushed back a lot. He wasn't the strongest player, but he was slightly better than Evan Neal, right? Like, so it's like we also got to see that a little bit as well.
It's not good. That's not a good thing. That's not a good reality.
That one's not good. Neither of those two things are good.
Yeah.
Your $160 million quarterback and your 7th overall pick are getting outperformed by Tyree Phillips and Tyrod Taylor. That is not good.
And if we get and if there's another year of it, just to circle back to what we were saying like 10 minutes ago, if there's another year of that, I just don't know if you're going to be able to withstand what the New York media is going to do.
Right? You piled that on, another year of that potentially, and another year of a new defensive coordinator coming in, potentially with an even front, potentially just way different communication issue. Like, it's a tough spot, and it's interesting.
Especially if the resentment that we talked about on the last podcast that the defense could harbor for Brian Daboll, if there is resentment, if that's actually a thing too, and the locker room starts to fracture, and that could be a real problem. Like Dory Jackson, he's not going to be back. He was on the Fan today though, and he said something to the effect like, "I just can't believe like Wink Martindale left like that." Now I didn't listen to the interview, so I saw this on Twitter just before.
I want to hear that, yeah.
But I don't know if he was saying like, "I can't believe he did that to us," or like, "I can't believe that's the way they did him dirty." So whoever listened to that, I'm not sure what show it was on. I believe it was on the Fan. But it does seem like there's a lot of players who love Wink Martindale, like we said. That could have a lasting effect. It just could. It could, and that could ultimately bring down this entire thing.
Which, sucks.
They're professionals, though. You hope that it doesn't. But if they suck, Dan, if they suck for 3 or 4 weeks and the defense isn't working out, and they have a situation like the Eagles ran into this year where they bench a defensive, like there's a lot of ways this could go south.
There are a lot of ways this can go south. Hopefully there are ways this can go north too, though, Nick.
Yeah. I don't want to make.
No, I know.
Like that. Yeah,
but it's fair. You have to call it like you call it, and you have to call it objectively. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm very optimistic about 2024 right now, because the opposite is true. I'm as pessimistic as I've ever been at this stage of an offseason, because I don't have much faith at all that there's any kind of ceiling with Daniel Jones as the QB1. Maybe they can grind out to another 9 or 10 wins, maybe, if things break perfectly right. But I don't see much of a ceiling there with Jones anymore, and I'm beyond that point. And so, if Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are and the effed up thing, Nick, is just this because like it's some people, I feel like some people feel like there's a lot of authority and ability to change your fortunes as a GM and coach in this spot. I don't agree with them, man. Like, they're at the 6th pick. There may not be an elite level quarterback in their mind, and I wouldn't blame them, because quite frankly, outside of those 3, I have my questions about Penix. I have my questions about McCarthy. I have my questions about everyone else besides those 3. And I would even say besides the 2. To me, the ones that I'm very confident in from a trait standpoint. And again, this doesn't mean I think they're going to be the next top 5 quarterback, because everything can change. Traits don't always work. But Williams and May are the guys. And they're not going to really have, I don't think they're really going to have opportunity out of those guys. So, to be quite frank. And so, that's the effed up thing to me, Nick, about it. Like, they may lose their jobs, Schoen and Daboll, and it may never have been really their opportunity of getting anything better, because last offseason there was no way to upgrade over Jones, and this offseason it doesn't. I'm not so sure there might be a way to upgrade over him either.
So I'm sure they know better than we do what's going on in the building. I'm sure they're saying everything that's confident, but they could like feel a little bit of heat. Like, that seat could be getting kind of hot. Do they pick a quarterback to try to give them an extra year? Like that, those type of questions start to creep in too,
if you draft
right?
a quarterback, it buys them a year.
It does buy them a year. It absolutely buys them
I hope they don't, Nick, let me just say this. I hope that they don't do things like that, because that feels very Gettleman-y to me. Selfish move based on what you think will be best for you. Remember, I'm going to retire in Nantucket knowing I got this team a franchise quarterback with Daniel Jones. I'm going to retire in Nantucket knowing I got this team a gold jacket player in Saquon Barkley. Gold jacket. When's that gold jacket coming, Nick? The guy was like 49th, and I'm not trying to bash Barkley. He had a bad O-line, but like, that's not a gold jacket player, really. And it's a running back. But, I don't want Joe Schoen to step into this thing, Nick, saying, "Hey, look, Brian, if we draft someone, We get extra time. I need them to believe in that quarterback, to have elite traits, to be one of these top 5 guys.
Agreed. But I don't even think they have to have that conversation. I think it could just be inherent. It could just be them talking themselves into a quarterback and seeing
Oh,
the bright spots. This is the human condition. This is what we do
I
as humans,
know.
man. If we want to believe something, we will be biased to
Oh,
force that belief.
so
And
right.
that could be something that they do, knowing like deep down, not ever vocalizing it, that it's going to buy them some
Yes.
time. And then they ignore, like, hey, yeah, he can't really read the blitz, but yeah, we'll teach him that. We'll teach him
Right.
that part, and
We'll
that's
get into
an
that
issue that I
part.
can have.
Of course, it's exactly what we saw play out with Dave Gettleman and Daniel Jones. He didn't get Herbert. Herbert didn't declare for that draft. He loved
It's
Herbert.
devastating.
He went to the Senior Bowl. He said, "I like this Daniel Jones kid, I guess, and let's go back and watch
Yeah.
some tape." And by that point of the process, what you just broke down, Nick, what you just outlined, had already been manifesting. That inherent bias by that point was already taking over for Dave and the guys who made that decision, obviously. And Daniel's whatever. He's an okay guy. It is what it is. But like the honest truth of it is, anyone who evaluates the draft could tell you he would never really had elite upside, in my
Of
opinion.
course.
And it's not even, that's undeniable. Not an elite arm, not an elite processor. It's just, it never really had the chance to be top 3 Mahomes, that type of style quarterback. And I don't really want to invest a first round pick unless I feel like that guy can get there. I'm past the point of forcing the Brandon Whedons and the Daniel Joneses of the world. Like,
Oh,
I just like, you need a quarterback, you take a quarterback. I don't want that anymore. I only want, if you feel this guy has the arm talent, all the things to be top 3, top 5, the guy that you can pay $47 million in cap space, 18%. What is Daniel Jones going to make? 19% of the
19.
Giants cap next year. You can allocate 19 and still have a chance to compete. Mahomes is still a chance the Chiefs have it this year to win, maybe. Josh Allen, the Bills still have a chance, but he's getting 20% of the cap. Mahomes getting 20%. It has to be one of those guys. If it's not one of those guys, I don't want it anymore. Or I'm fine with it, but take it in round 2. Do it the Jalen Hurts route. Use your second round pick instead of your first round pick. And that's fine with me. And I ultimately think if I had to put my money on it right now, Nick, my guess is one of the 2 second round picks will be a quarterback for the Giants. That's my guess. No quarterback round 1. They don't have the opportunity. They can't get May. They can't get Williams. No trade up. That's it. Jaden Daniels off the board. They don't want to do it. They don't want to force it, and they go second round. And that, to me, I'd rather take that gamble in round 2 on a guy who doesn't necessarily have those all the elite traits, than take that gamble at round 1 because you have to force it. You have to get something. That's me.
I'm right there with you, man.
Yeah.
And before we get out of here, I want
Yeah.
to just acknowledge that Darren Waller's name also came up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Darren Waller, the media asked Joe Schoen, is he a part of your plan moving forward? And Joe Schoen said, yeah, like we like Darren Waller. I think the quote was, I would do the trade again. Like we
Yep.
would do the trade again. And then he said, like, he finished the season strong. And I'm right there with him too, man. Like whoever is the quarterback, like Darren Waller, a healthy Darren Waller, and that's like the big if. Even when they made this
Right.
trade, we said it's a big if. But a healthy Darren Waller gives you a mismatch nightmare, somebody who is going to thrive on those 7 routes, on those deep horizontal crossing routes, who's going to dictate coverage like we saw. I hate how we have like singular like plays we can point. Like we saw though on the first play of the second half in week 2 with Jalen Hyde on that deep post, like that safety bit down because he saw Waller coming on the horizontal cross, which allowed Hyatt to establish inside leverage against the cornerback Marco Wilson and just absolutely burn him. Unfortunately, it wasn't a touchdown, but the Giants ended up scoring shortly after. So I was right there with him with the Darren Waller thing. It's frustrating because the guy gets injured often, but I still think he could be a valuable asset to the 2024 Giants. If you want to, you have to compete in 2024. If you're this coaching staff, you can't suck again. So he has to be part of that recipe.
I'm with you on that, by the way. And I've made that clear. I'm going to be more pro Waller than most. I think somebody in my replies put it best. They're like, yeah, Waller should be part of the team's plan. It's not his fault. He's not meant to have 52 cat. Like he's not like it. The volume that he got this year when he was healthy and the state of the passing game is not really his fault, in my opinion. You gotta, at least before Tyrod got there, it was, and once Tyrod got there, it was great.
It's not his fault. And it's also to point back to Joe Schoen, man. Like we said, the calculated risks that Joe Schoen took, they all blew up in Joe Schoen's face. Every single one of those calculated risks blew up in his
not
face.
All. Bobby Okereke didn't blow up, at least.
That's not a calculated risk.
Yeah,
that was just the
right.
calculated risk at the final cuts. Like, okay. Eric Gray, we're not going to put you through the practice squad because you're going to get scooped up. You could be in our future plans. Let's make you the punt returner. Yeah, that will work. Even though he had 2 punt returns in 2021 and he muffed them both. Like that was a big risk. Didn't
It
work
was.
out. Had 2 muffs in like what, seven attempts. And that's just putting a kid who isn't necessarily great in that situation in a bad situation and expecting. Josh Azudu, yeah, you could be the swing tackle. Tyree Phillips, bye-bye. We'll see you later. That was an absolute disaster. And then keeping Darren Waller and Lawrence Cager with Daniel Bellinger, 2 basically wide receivers, no other blocking tight end other than Daniel Bellinger. So when Daniel Bellinger went down in week 4, Darren Waller, who can block, but you want to use his receiving upside, Darren Waller became basically just a de facto blocker, chip and release type of guy. You can't maximize his ability to create mismatches against the defense. That was another risk. Now I want to give Joe Schoene a little bit of a reprieve. Possibly Tommy Sweeney was supposed to be that guy, but Tommy Sweeney ended up suffering. I'm not even 100% certain what exactly it was. He ended up suffering something that was pretty bad, and he could not play football anymore. Tommy Sweeney would have been a much better blocker than a Lawrence Cager, but you still didn't investigate other options. And you said, we'll roll with Lawrence Cager. I like Lawrence Cager, but when you have Darren Waller, that is redundant. And you need another Daniel Bellinger type.
Yes.
So that was another calculated risk that blew up that I also feel like stifled the production of Darren Waller.
Yeah, you're right. And we'll have to see this next year how it goes. And obviously, he'll have to be healthier. Joe Schoene even mentioned like he was lighting up camp and training and preseason, and you guys saw it with your own eyes. And then he got that injury before the Dallas game, and that's just unfortunate. I don't think he ever recovered from that injury for the Dallas game. I think he played some games this year at less than 100%. I think given what you saw on the tape last year with the Raiders, especially that Steelers game, Nick, I remember that one specifically versus what we saw this year. I felt like he was a tick faster last year on tape, and I don't think it was because he's older now. I think it was because he was injured before that Dallas game. He tried to come back from it. He did the best he could this year. You didn't want to miss the whole season, but that injury left him never 100%. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to get 100% Darren Waller at any point for any stretch, given his injury history. But the upside of that, given all the things you said, makes this offense a lot better. So I'm with it too, and I'm happy Joe Schoene is on board with that. All right, that's all the time we have for today, Nick. We're going to be back soon to talk more Giants football. The news comes fast, so there's no real timeline for it, but we'll be discussing as the news breaks, as you always get from us in the offseason. So thank you for tuning in. It's the most fun time to talk Giants football these days. So have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.